a proton and a proton can live side by side, whereas a proton is positive, another proton is positive, they should repel each other. But the strong force is so strong that it holds them together. So there are these four forces. And the belief has been that if you can write one equation for all these four forces, then you can, explain an atom, you can explain a nucleus, you can explain molecules.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the harbor grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Water.
Would you like some water?
Yeah.
Okay. I should first acknowledge the fact that I was a little trepidatious about this particular event. Physics and me have not had a very good relationship, I have to say. As a child of a father who was a gold medalist in physics,
Yeah.
I had a lot to live up to, and I didn't, unfortunately. So I was a little challenged. But it's such a beautiful novel about physics and faith, about logic and desire and so many different things. But before we start, I believe you're going to read a little bit of a passage for us,
okay.
just to set the tone
Yeah.
a little bit.
This book is far from an autobiography, so people shouldn't. If it were, then I would have been to Stockholm and back, which I have not.
Well, you would have
Where
won a
I've been-
Nobel Prize as well.
Maybe Göteborg was the closest I got. And this is a scene where this guy, the protagonist, the main character in this book is called Nurul Islam. He is a very famous physicist. And the book is inspired by a real physicist called Abdul Salam, who went on to win the Nobel Prize and one of the great physicists of the 20th century. So I was inspired by his life, because what amazed me was that he was in a field of abstract physics with the likes of Feynman and Einstein and Weinberg and all these people who, the belief was, even when I entered MIT, that you could explain everything using the laws of physics. You study matter and understand how matter in the manifestation of yourself tries to understand itself. So it was a very, coming from East Africa and so on, it was really intriguing, a very fascinating idea that you don't have a need for God. If you can explain everything using the laws of physics, which are based on observations around you, then what is the need for God? I mean, it's unnecessary at the very least. And so what amazed me was this guy he was born in undivided India. So kind of when he left, the country was not divided yet, but he was citizen of Pakistan after the partition of India. And but he was one guy who was completely believed in God, observant. And I couldn't understand how and why. So I thought, it would be a good thing to write a novel about such a guy. But of course, it would be fictitious. I didn't know the Abdul Salam I had heard of, but he was of a different, kind of a previous generation. And I had never met him personally. I just imagined a character who had these basic traits, which I used as building blocks to build my own character. So this is what it is. That's the background, of a man who tries to explain everything, but still believes in God. So this is a conversation, maybe at the dining room table or at the living room, between him and his wife, who is also from Pakistan. It takes place in London, because he's a professor at the University of London. So he says, "Imagine, John, my darling, try to explain everything that exists, from the stars to this cup in my hand, how they are put together. That's what we are trying to do in physics nowadays. It may be possible in a sense, but isn't everything there is Allah Himself?" she said. He stared at her with a smile, and she felt a glow of pride. She was not so naive, and she was his wife after all. Some people believe that, he said, but there is a difference. We pray to Allah and we praise Him and His Prophet. But can't that everything be praised? She asked. Yes, he said, but you don't have to kneel to it or fear its wrath. If you understand the fundamental laws of physics, then you understand how the universe works. And Abe and his like will say, there is no need for a God. But Allah can change these laws, she said. Then what? That, my dear, he said, was a quarrel between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he is called, 1,000 years ago. There was a big controversy 1,000 years ago between these two philosophers, because Ghazali said, if you put a piece of cotton wool close to a flame, it will not catch fire unless God wills it. I think it's an old argument in theology, Sakina Begum had never had, that's the wife, had never had doubts about him, about God. But then she never asked questions about his creation. She did not need fervor either in her worship, and she certainly could not recite from the book by heart, nor did she need to listen to the tapes of recitals from the book. It was a man's job to tussle with God. It was a woman's job to tussle with man. But not their Moni, their daughter. She would be a bright star, he said, like Marie Curie, a great scientist. But Sakina Begum wasn't so sure about that. She wanted Moni to grow up a normal woman. There was some virtue in being normal.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for also introducing the book, which I was going to ask you to do, so you've preempted me in so many ways. So as we heard, you were born in Nairobi, grew up in Dar es Salaam, and then you earned a BS from MIT and a PhD in actually nuclear physics from the University of Pennsylvania. So could you talk a little bit about that early interest in the sciences or in physics? Who were you as a young child? What were your dreams and aspirations?
I'm not sure. I think physics and maths looked easy when I was growing up. And also in that culture, you didn't think of arts or writing or something. Science was everything, and I was good at it. It was just how good, whether you were the top or the next to the top. So it was obvious. And then at some point, someone came to our school and said, why don't you apply to this American universities? So I applied to MIT and a couple of others. And they sent big fat catalogs, in those days, with glossy pictures, and it was just mind-boggling. And so we just applied, and then we got admitted, and then we entered kind of the whole world opened up, It was like a whole universe, I never recovered from that. It was like being reborn, into a world of, and also to learn about literature, because for the first time I could afford to buy books. With my little, scholarship money, I could go to the bookstore and buy books, which I was also interested in. So it was but in the 60s and 70s, maybe even now, but at MIT and Harvard and, Caltech and places like that, there was such a buzz of excitement. People, the students came there with a mission. They were out to do something extraordinary. In fact, even the professor said, look, don't think you will overthrow Einstein. For these kids who came from the top, from every part of the United States and abroad, we had students from Ethiopia and Ghana and, Nigeria and so on. There was just, nobody thought they could not do anything. So it was that excitement that I still miss,
You eventually came to Canada in 1978. It was a job, I believe, in a nuclear facility.
It was a fellowship at the Atomic Energy of Canada in Deep River. So I went from New York and Philadelphia to Deep River, population 5,500. It never went up. Didn't come down either.
Stayed constant. We know about
But it
constants.
was beautiful, by the river and the trees, and it was beautiful. The only problem is that to get to anywhere took you at least 3 hours, And I went by bus. I came back from Montreal by bus, and it would drop us off on the highway, and it came at 3 a.m. and then you walked to your apartment. So it was a different life, But it was an experience.
But was the world of physics still engrossing you, or was the pull of literature on you?
Well, I had already started even as a graduate student. I think there was a question of identity, who I was, because I was brought up in an Indian tradition in Africa. So the African politics and everything, so I knew it was all around us, right? Mozambique and Angola and South Africa and Rhodesia, so we were there, part of it. But India was still very distant, at least in my community. So when I went to an American university, you start asking, who are you, Everyone around you is from somewhere. They know who they are. And so I started looking up Indian philosophies and Indian literature, which was very much in the vogue in those days. And the bookstores had big sections about Indian philosophy. And the gurus would come, Sufis would come. This was late 60s, early 70s. Very exciting period, but mind open your mind, but also a lot of doubts, And that everything you sort of took for granted, you started questioning, What's so special about you? In a little town in Africa, we thought we were on top of the world, You come to the real world and you find you are nobody, So then that's how I started reading literature. Fiction, of course, I always enjoyed from high school days. But then reading up philosophies, and I took, when I was a graduate student in physics, I took 2 years of Sanskrit.
Really?
I just wanted to find out, go back to the point zero of my life. Of course, it doesn't exist, but I had to do it. So my interest in history began there.
But even as a child, I understand that you had composition classes where you were trying to
we always had to.
write.
Beginning, we had to write 10 lines of a composition. Later on, we had to write 3 paragraphs. And it really made a difference, you find people now, I come across people who just don't know how to do it. How to follow one sentence after another logically. So we had, I think, a good training. May not be the right thing to say, but it was kind of English tradition or British tradition in education that had its rigor. And every week you had to write 10 lines. Most people hated it. Only 2 people in our class who liked it, me and my close friend. We just enjoyed writing, just saying what we thought. So from that, I guess the need to write, because if you want to find out who you are, then you also want to express. And that's when I started writing.
So you'd started very early to express yourself, and then in university you're discovering new worlds, ideas of identity. What was it that made you sort of sit down and write that first big novel? Because your novels take time. Even this one, it's a process of years, right? So what was that first impetus?
Well, the first novel is called The Gunny Sack. It's called The Gunny Sack because by the time I arrived in Toronto, 1980, I somehow had a feeling that I might never be able to go back home. I still had a sense of home, which is where I came from. And I realized that I might not be able to go home. And I felt burdened by the weight of memories, my own memories, the stories my mother would tell me about her family, the stories that went around in our community, our religious community. the stories that just were around, And then, of course, the history of the country that I lived in, the independence and pre-independence and so on. All of that, I thought would just disappear, and I felt weighed down. And I had this romantic imagination, a romantic image. And maybe I read too much Hermann Hesse, as a student. And this romantic image was of a young man carrying a bag of memories, And he's weighed down by it. He sits down and he starts picking out memories one by one. And of course, the job for a writer is, how do you actually transform that into a novel? So for me, what it became was, it was a real gunny sack of objects which this young man in Spadina somewhere inherits. He gets it, someone brings it to him, and he takes these objects, each of which has an association with a story, or an event, or a person. And he starts bringing them out and sort of connecting them and telling stories. So that was my first novel. Of course, the thing about such a composition is that if you take out objects in another order, you would get another novel, because, the connections would be different. So that was the first novel.
So skipping many, many years ahead to this particular novel, you mentioned Abdus Salam. When did you first hear about, Mr. Salam, and what was?
Well, he was it was a name when I was an undergraduate, but just so busy as an undergraduate, I didn't pay much attention. And I remember one guy, in fact, 2 years ago, I went to meet him in Lahore. He was with me at MIT, and he said, Abdul Salam is at Harvard. I said, oh yeah, okay. But much later, you got the Nobel Prize, and you get to know more about him. And then, of course, this whole enigma of a person who deals with abstract theories about matter, who also believes in a creator. And that took hold of me, because I never dealt with physics per se in my writing, because, what's the life of a physicist? He goes to a theoretical physicist. They go to the desk, start, one formula, another formula, you write a program, maybe a debugger program, you find the results and so on. It's not a very interesting life, except personal life, which, there's not much going on, unless you start writing about the lives of the atoms and electrons and nuclei. So I never thought I would be even interested in writing about a physicist. But then this idea occurred to me, and I thought, maybe let me try this one. I write about a person like him, or at least similar to him. And see, the problem with this book, writing this book, which took me some time to resolve, and maybe it's a trivial problem, but I couldn't decide was, the physicist is fictitious. The physicists he works with, at Harvard especially, are fictitious. Maybe slightly based on, I didn't know them personally anyway. But the physics, should I make it fiction or real? And it was a very trivial kind of answer, but it took me a while to say, okay, let me make the physicist fictional and the physics real, the theories real. And because then anyone from physics who knows about these theories will look at it, oh, say, yeah, this is so make the connection. But this is how I came to write this novel. Once I had decided that this is how I would do it, then of course I read about Abdul Salam. I can't lie because there's a biography of him. There was a guy in England who really had a kind of vendetta against him. So you got to know more about him. He was an amazing guy because he just, when he won the Nobel Prize, by that time he had married a second wife. And which is amazing. And both wives, when he went to the Nobel Prize, he had to go to Stockholm with the king and whatever. And he took both his wives with him. They both went there. So, it That life is an amazing life, you know. So I thought that, but I fictionalized. I didn't reach the point where he takes both wives there, you know. In my case, the one wife dies, you know, at some point.
So,
But the whole dynamic of how the two wives interact, because it is not there's no viciousness to it, you know. I mean, he married. He was an arranged marriage. He loved his wife, but she was a wife. And then he meets someone who is intellectually his equal, and he cannot control himself, you know. So but he cannot be disloyal to his first wife. The only thing he can do is marry a second wife, which is allowed by the laws of God, according to Islam. So he marries a second wife. And you know, that went on. I don't know exactly how the dynamics worked, but I sort of invented that, you know.
So spoiler alert. Lots of spoilers have been given over here, but please do still read the book. So you'd heard of this person. You were kind of fascinated by the life that he led, and then you sort of resolved this idea of, okay, making the characters fictitious, but the science real. Could you talk a little bit about the research? Because, certainly, you're a nuclear physicist, you know a lot of the physics, but nevertheless trying to explain the greater unification theory, the weaker unification, things that I had never thought I'd consider myself thinking about in this particular
But to explain the physics is very simple.
I see.
Of course, the mathematics, the real one, is very hard.
You're talking to somebody who
It's
can
what has to
barely
do with
remember.
what they call field theory. You know, it's really abstract. You know, but the idea is that you have, gravitation, which is how we can sit down without floating in air. There's a gravitation force. There's an electromagnetic force, which is the electrons and the protons, and the charge of an electron, the charge of a proton. So the attraction is electrical, and then of course there's a magnetic force. So anyone who has done high school physics knows that electric force and magnetic force are essentially the same. So you have electromagnetic, you have the gravitation, and you have what is called, again, high school physics was kind of beta reaction, where a heavy nucleus gives off an electron. So that process is called the weak interaction. Then, of course, there is a strong interaction, which is how a neutron and a proton can live side by side in a nucleus. Or a proton and a proton can live side by side, whereas a proton is positive, another proton is positive, they should repel each other. But the strong force is so strong that it holds them together. So there are these four forces. And the belief has been that if you can write one equation for all these four forces, then you can explain an atom, you can explain a nucleus, you can explain molecules, and from molecules you can explain life, and so on. So that is the physics, right? It's very difficult. And Abdul Salam, and a guy at Harvard called Weinberg, they were the first, and there was a third guy called Glashow. They wrote an equation which combined the electromagnetic, the electric force with the weak force. So it was a big breakthrough. But that's the basic physics in words, and that's how he explains in his lectures.
So you explain these theories.
But the research didn't come into physics. I thought I would have to do it. Mm-hmm. I borrowed some field theory books from the U of T library, but I found that I didn't have to go into that.
Excellent.
But the research came into the culture of Islam, because I was brought up in a different culture. I knew about Islam. I knew about Muslims. I knew something about Islamic history. But to be honest, what I put in here was research, history, because I know people. When I was at MIT, there were people at Harvard who were studying Islam and so on. So I got to know some of these issues, which I never knew before. Some of the beliefs, some of the life of the Prophet. We have the basic rudimentary lives of the Prophet, but not the details which are contained in certain books. So that my research was basically that. And then I did research on it's kind of extremists, Islamic extremists, I mean the real lunatics who are against science. And therefore, I mean, they happen to be in the book. Since I'm in my kind of, towards the end of my career, not end, I have 2 books coming. I thought all the research I have done, why not put them at the back of the book? So at the back of the book, I have all the links and websites, etc. Well, I said, what can they do to me? So I'll put them in. If I was younger, I would be scared,
With age comes fearlessness. Amazing.
Yeah.
But this is also because Mr. Salam also, I mean, yes, he won the Nobel, but in many ways he was almost forgotten, right? Or his history wasn't quite remembered.
No, he's known, but physics progresses so fast that new theories come up and so on. But you still see him mentioned. But you see, his thing was, he really believed that science and, fundamental science, not just engineering, building bridges, fundamental science should be available to all of humanity. So his mission was to start an institute of fundamental physics, where they would invite people from, Africa and Asia and small countries where there was no money to do such research. And it exists in Trieste, the Institute of Physics. And he contributed a good part of his Nobel money to that institute. So that, of course, was one thing that he was passionate about. After his Nobel Prize, that's what he worked on. He had an office in Trieste at the Institute of, it's called Fundamental Physics. And it was his creation. But he had to go around the world, talking to different world leaders, asking for money, Indira Gandhi, and this guy, and Nyerere, and so on. Just we need an institute where all of humanity can participate. It is not the purview of the Western world, And that was his belief also.
He also came from a particular sect of Islam, which, at some point in Pakistan was almost there was a sense that they're not Islamic, right? So
yeah.
There was this tussle between, he is a man of faith. He's also a physicist, but at the same time, his faith is being challenged. So could you talk a little bit about that and how that informed?
It is one of the tragedies. I think it was a tragedy in his life. It broke him because, when he was a younger physicist, the Pakistan government used him as an advisor for their Atomic Energy Commission, reactors and so on. He was a hero. And then at some point after the Bangladesh war, because of pressure on the Prime Minister, Bhutto, his sect, which is a kind of, it's a very sect which believes in the Quran and the God and so on, but it has other elements to it. And the fundamentalists convinced Bhutto to declare that sect, it's called Ahmadiyya, un-Islamic. Now, how can a parliament decide who is a Muslim and not? This is one of the, and that's what they did. And so this guy was a hero to many, Pakistani students and citizens. And suddenly he was told, you are not a Muslim. He couldn't go to Mecca, for example. So, that's how, that's the kind of, towards the end of his life. Well, that's how it was. It's a tragedy. And what happened was he insisted on being buried in Pakistan, in the town, I think, close to where he was born. So his body was taken back, and I think they sort of gave it a reception. I'm not 100% sure. And then, I don't know why they have to write this, but on the gravestone, they wrote the first Muslim Nobel Prize winner in physics, something like that. I don't think it's really necessary. He's a Nobel Prize winner, fine. If you read his name, you know where he comes from. But some people want to put that. So the community decided they wanted to put it. Now every year someone goes around and rubs out the Islamic part from his gravestone. I mean, this is, people, young physicists worship these guys, and then there are these guys who blot them out.
Was it that tussle between faith and physics that really intrigued you? Because because he I mean, Nurul as well has very clear ideas about God and about physics, and he sort of is, as we heard in the little excerpt that
when you read about people, you get different stories, and then you decide, I'm going to use this one. So there's one big book on that period where they say, this guy, when you have faith and when you are this big in terms of your stature, you can play around with God. You can tell God, look away. And he would, I think at some point in his life he sort of drank scotch, at least some people say. And some people say that, when he went to the cafeteria, he would say, look at the sausage roll, and he said, don't tell me what's in it. But he was Abdul Salam, What can God do to him?
But beyond the tussle between faith and physics, there's also, personal tussles that are coming in. Colleagues, there's his wives, all of these kind of very human betrayals.
It's a very human story, like his relationship with his two children. He buys cricket bats for his sons, and there's fight over who's going to use the cricket bat first. Or he gives them, like a typical Indo-Pakistani parent, buys them science books. And he adores his wife, but she's a kind of very homely Punjabi wife who looks after him. And she was also, when she first comes to London, she's not very sophisticated. And if you are not in England, if there's 50s and 60s, you can imagine your life. So they said, but he sort of taught her and just said, we can learn, we can do all of that. So the family life is very important. Because it is the story of a man, and his family. It is not a story about physics. He happens to be a famous physicist, which somehow defines. And he sees it in one way. One way he describes the world of physics for him is contained. Once he enters it, there's nothing outside of it. But then he says, once in a while, the outside world tunnels in. There's a kind of tunneling effect, in physics. The world outside tunnels in, and then his wife calls, so buy a present for my someone's wedding. And so, it's that kind of life, and he lives with it, a lot of people do that. You have one life where you're just engrossed in it. You're a kind of a mystic. And then the real world comes and, it makes demands on you. What are we going to eat?
The second wife of his, Hillary in this case, is a young graduate student whom he meets. And there is that kind of, as you said, this intellectual camaraderie between them that sort of grows. The real Abdus Salam also was married to a molecular biologist.
She was an English woman. I met her into a kind of Massachusetts, girl from Salem. I don't know what the other one was like, but she was a very brilliant biologist. She became a dame of the British Empire, so it's No small feat. And she died about 5-6 years ago.
How did you imagine what their interaction would be?
I just imagined,
Of course.
I just imagined that, this is what it would be like. Just meeting someone and you just know there's an attraction, and then you're caught in a bind, and someone takes a photo.
Tension to build in this room.
Yeah, and then the wife's reaction. Very typical, but very understandable.
I'm just kind of curious as to how you reconcile yourself with this. I mean, it sounds intriguing, and I don't know how the real Abdus Salam managed this life, but I'm just kind of curious as to this all made sense to you in your imagining.
Well, when you build a family, a family unit, then I think it's almost automatic, what will happen, what can happen. The most negative thing can happen, or something in between. And you had a character who was a cousin, in fact, from Pakistan. That was a wife, and there was a family there. And back there, of course, second marriages happen. It seemed either the wife would, but the wife has a revenge in some sense, not quite meaning to the severity of the revenge, which in fact destroys him in a sense. She does something which she doesn't quite know why, to what extent, but she does it. So there is that. And then when she's sort of dying, she calls him, and she says, I'm wife number one, you better come. So there is that, you just imagine it, but somehow it seemed to make sense.